Disabuse is about equipping churches and faith-based organizations with the ability to be aware of, detect, investigate, and eliminate abuse in their organizations and institutions. I am really pleased today to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Freyd. She's a globally recognized and award-winning psychology researcher, author, educator, speaker. She is the founder and president of the Center for Institutional Courage. Dr. Freyd is widely published and renowned scholar known for her theories of betrayal trauma, institutional betrayal, institutional courage, and something called DARVO, which we're going to unpack in the interview. She received her PhD in psychology from Stanford University, and she is a well-known scholar providing both ad hoc training for universities right across the world. Welcome to our podcast, Disabuse, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is. It's a personal pleasure for me because I've been looking at, researching, interacting with many folks that are in the field of eliminating abuse in all its form. I know that your particular area of expertise was developed in the specific kind of abuse of sexual abuse, and we're going to get to that in a moment. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us here today. So even though this podcast is focused on raising both awareness and solutions to the issues of abuse in all its forms in churches and faith-based organizations, your theories on DARVO, institutional betrayal, and betrayal trauma are universal. Whether it be in a church, whether it be at a university, whether it be in employment, whether it be in sport. Maybe we can start with DARVO theory, which has become very well known. I mean, if you just Google DARVO, you're going to get pages upon pages of information related to DARVO, even an episode of South Park, where there's a bit of, obviously, a tongue-in-cheek illustration of DARVO at its finest. So, Dr. Freyd, can you tell our listeners when and how you developed DARVO theory?
Sure. So I should start by saying what DARVO is. DARVO is an acronym, DARVO, and it stands for D, deny, A, attack, and RVO is reverse victim and offender. And it's something that people who are being held accountable for a wrongdoing may engage in. So they may deny the accusation and say, I absolutely did not do that. They may attack the person making the accusation. Usually they attack the credibility of the person and say, oh, your memories are poor, we're drunk, you are just doing this for attention. Essentially saying this person has no credibility. And then RVO is the most insidious and powerful part, where the person being accused adopts the victim role and casts the person making the allegation into the perpetrator. So the person being accused might say, you're ruining my life, you're harming my reputation, you're hurting my family, you're a horrible person, you are cruel. In one way or another, makes the person who was trying often to speak truth into the enemy role. And we have concepts that are related to this, like shoot the messenger. Mm-hmm. But it's quite this pattern is quite powerful. And it was a concept that I first introduced in the 90s based on observation. I observed what happened in my own life when I tried to confront past wrongdoings, and I observed it happening around me. And one of the most vivid examples for me in the 90s was watching, I'm in the United States, watching the hearings, the congressional hearings regarding the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court, and how Anita Hill was treated during those hearings. And Clarence Thomas, prior to being in the judiciary, had had a leadership role in the EEOC, which was a federal agency tasked with addressing discrimination and oppression. And it struck me watching the response Clarence Thomas had to Anita Hill's accusations of sexual harassment and the response all the people around him had,
Mm-hmm.
that it was surprising, because Clarence Thomas, as a leader in the EOC, would know that it's really hard to talk about sexual harassment. And what he could have said was, oh, let's say he was innocent or believed he was innocent or wanted to present himself as innocent. He could have said, oh, my memory is very different than yours. I'm very disturbed to hear what you're saying. I need to understand it better. I do know these are really difficult topics to discuss, and it's important for our society to be able to discuss these topics. But that's not at all what happened. He utterly denied the accusations. He attacked Anita Hill, everything about her credibility. And he put himself entirely into the victim role and made her out to be this terrible person. And the thing I want to point out about this is it's presumably something people do to deflect blame. And we can talk about what the research reveals, but it also has an impact on all sorts of other people who might not be part of that situation if they observe it happening. Who's going to want to talk about sexual harassment after seeing that? Right. So it's got this really profound impact on the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for unpacking, both what DARVO is and what prompted you to start to research this particular phenomenon. I can tell you from my own experience, having either conducted or overseen investigations for almost 40 years, that it is a pattern that I can tell you anecdotally has existed since I've been doing investigations. And my former role in policing, investigating serious crime, organized crime, homicide, rape and those types of things. I mean, we would see that all the time. It would just become, we knew to anticipate that the only defense that they're going to have is to discredit the accuser. Coming into the world of workplace investigations, or what we call administrative investigations. So we do hundreds a year, both in workplace, in sport, in the churches, in regulatory world. And so this pattern of behavior, I teach how to conduct administrative investigations. And I have 2 slides with your face on it and talking about DARVO. And because, your research, your academic research confirmed my anecdotal experiences of this phenomenon of attacking the credibility and becoming the victim, getting people to feel sorry for you, that, basically playing a poor me, right? Poor me, I'm now being attacked. And you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned the word insidious. And this is where I'm particularly interested to understand is, what level of malevolence drives someone to go to such an extent that they would absolutely try to destroy someone's life, absolutely, tarnish their credibility, obliterate their credibility, and cause so much pain and trauma after the initial pain and trauma that was caused by their behavior in the first place? And I'm not sure if you've done a deep dive into that level of malevolence or not.
Well, it's a great question. And we have been conducting empirical research on DARVO for the past now almost 10 years and published quite a bit of it. And we started with questions about what DARVO's effect was on the person being DARVO'd, as well as its effects on how observers understood what happened. Is it effective in making people believe that the person being accused is innocent? And I can tell you about that work, but I'm going to skip to our last sort of domain because it's so relevant to your question, which is the question being, who uses DARVO? Like, who are these people? Right. And, I do think to some extent people use DARVO because they've learned to do it from the world around them, from their families. And so it's a pattern of behavior they've learned. But it is, in fact, strongly correlated with some other differences in people. So we looked at 3 kinds of things that might be related to. One is attitudes, one is behaviors, and one is personality factors or features. So attitudes that we looked at was basically in the domain of sexual harassment was was people who believe myths about rape. So these are people who believe that in some way women deserve to be sexually assaulted or harassed. And there's very good measurement instruments for what are called rape myths. And we found a very strong correlation between using DARVO and believing in rape myths, endorsing them and saying, yeah, basically it's the victim's fault, victim blaming beliefs. In terms of behavior, there are measures now to get at people's engaging in sexual harassment. And again, what we found was that people who use DARVO are more likely, and very much so, these are very strong correlations, to engage in sexual harassment. So it's associated with behavior. And I think you'd be really fascinated by our findings with personality, because there's something called the dark triad in personality theory and psychology, and it's about antisocial personality characteristics, and it measures the features of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And all of those features were very correlated as well with DARVO. So although people can learn DARVO in the environment, and not everybody who uses DARVO would, do these things, but just in terms of overall probabilities, it's a red flag. If somebody's using DARVO, I would say it's a red flag. It's not proof they did something, it's a red flag. The other point I just always want to remind people is that when somebody's using DARVO to deny a past event, when that past event's hard to be sure about, because maybe it's between two people and no one else is in the room, it's hard to investigate that. And there may be a certain level of uncertainty. The DARVO tends to happen pretty publicly because people don't realize they kind of tell on themselves, you might almost say, when they engage in DARVO, they don't realize how bad their behavior is. And we can hold people accountable for their DARVOing, even if we don't know what happened in the past. Even if somebody didn't do the thing they're accused of, the DARVO itself is harmful, and they shouldn't be allowed to DARVO. It's not necessary. As I gave in the example of how Clarence Thomas could have answered, people don't have to DARVO if they believe they're innocent.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You bring up an interesting point. If they believe they're innocent, or they are, and one of the criticisms of DARVO, because I've interacted on, as you know, I'm very active on LinkedIn, and so I'm about raising awareness. I mean, we conduct impartial investigations, but the name of our firm is Veritas, meaning truth, and so we truly believe that the pursuit of truth is critical to addressing the issues of abuse, whether they're false allegations or not. You and I both know that false allegations of sexual abuse is a very low percentage in terms of empirical evidence related to false accusations. But I had some pushback when I was just kind of really highlighting DARVO on my own LinkedIn feed, and someone was quite outraged that, well, that's the response of an innocent person as well. Deny, yeah. How do you explain it? Well, obviously bringing into question someone's credibility. Why would someone make a false allegation about me? And so what do you see as what's the response to those critics that say, well, it's also the response potentially of an innocent person?
Yeah, I mean, an innocent person could indeed DARVO, but it's not a necessary response, and it is a harmful response. It's not. So maybe this is a good time to tell you a little bit about our research on the effect of DARVO. So we have measured the impact on victims if they try to bring something forth, report an event, hold somebody accountable, and they get a DARVO response. That's not good for them. What we have measured is that they tend to blame themselves for what happened. They're more likely to have PTSD symptoms. Yeah. And they report when probed about it, that they find it very painful, that DARVO response. So it hurts the person making the accusation. And then the other thing we found in research is that if you're observing a DARVO response between two people, it tends to be effective at one level. It makes you doubt the victim. But it also makes you not like the person who's DARVOing very much either. Imagine instead somebody who is innocent, believes him or herself to be innocent, who says very calmly, I don't remember doing what you're saying I did. So denying, but denying in a calm, respectful way.
Right.
And then instead of accusing somebody of being, making it up or something, being curious, saying, I need to understand why this is what you remember and why you're saying this. That kind of response is going to reflect well on the person doing it.
Yeah.
So it's actually a better response for everybody than DARVO, including for the person being accused. And it's certainly better for the victim. And maybe most importantly, it's better for the world because it doesn't shut down necessary and important conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So, that outrage that you experienced, I think that the response to that is that DARVO doesn't prove guilt of past events. All it does is prove you've just behaved this way right now.
Right.
But it is, as I said, a red flag in that it's associated with problematic things and it doesn't help. There are better responses that are better all around. So, that's what I would say in regard to that.
I appreciate that, and I've said the same thing. Is that my experience is that someone that did engage in the misconduct who responds through DARVO, there's often a level of kind of maliciousness. There's aggression. There's anger. There's how can you believe that? There's this level of animosity and aggression that sometimes feels obviously over the top. And so discerning, I always talk about discernment because we do investigations. That's what we do. And so we have to discern credibility, and we do credibility assessments. And so when someone begins an interview starting off with a DARVO and it's nonstop, I've had a case where I've had to actually ask someone, said, well, I noticed that you spent the last 15 minutes telling me about what, this person has allegedly done. But I actually wanted to go back to the allegation where it's alleged that this happened. What can you tell me about that? And it's almost like a deflection mechanism. That's the one thing. Second thing is that I'm very familiar with the dark triad, and I teach a little bit on that on my advanced course as well. And in fact, I'll have to share my slides with you because right after the dark triad, I have DARVO and I have Jennifer Freyd and the DARVO response. Recently you and I interacted on LinkedIn where I talked about what I coined the malevolent master manipulator. And my concern about the malevolent master manipulator is that they will have informed themselves of DARVO. They will understand that I better not be seen to be DARVOing, and they will respond in such a way that you indicated earlier that there's, a level of, not contrition per se, but there's a level of, curiosity. Right. And I've experienced that. And so it's really critical, in my view, for someone that's tasked with investigating allegations, because I know you've done a lot of your research on university campuses. And we do a lot of work on university campuses, and we do training for people that are investigating university campuses, is that I always say that you cannot be naive. People may try to trick you, manipulate you as the investigator, number one, but nor can you be cynical because we have to be open-minded to all possibilities and we have to evaluate the evidence. And so there's this idea of the more we are aware of the type of person that may engage in DARVO, the more discerning we become. And frankly, really what your goal is and our goal is to eliminate abusive behavior that causes significant harm. And psychological harm coming out of sexual abuse, coming out of sexual harassment, even workplace bullying. I mean, there's a lot of research out there right now that says the bullying campaign can be as psychologically harmful as a sexual assault. And so this is critical stuff. And I can tell you, and I'm not sure what you're seeing, but we're seeing an increase in complaints.
I think you're making so many good points there, and the possibility that people, the manipulator who becomes educated about DARVO, then sort of crafts his manipulation to not look like they're DARVOing is a really horrifying concern. And it reminds me a little bit of the people who have figured out that apologies can um, make situations go away, and then um, give insincere apologies, which because they're manipulating. And the one thing I would say is that when people are faking apologies or faking curiosity, often you can detect it. You know something's not authentic in that situation. Now, a really, really skilled psychopath might get away with it anyway. There are people who are so skilled, they'll fool the best of us.
Yeah.
But more often, people who are faking contrition, you feel it.
Yeah.
And so, I would say, to people like, keep what you're saying, like keep your mind open and keep your senses very alive and awake, and trust yourself.
Yeah.
Like if it doesn't feel sincere, that doesn't prove it's not sincere, but that is a very powerful indication it might not be sincere.
Yeah, good point. You bring up a couple things, and I made myself a couple of notes as we're having this conversation, and the idea as well that some folks, the malevolent master manipulators, they get people around them, they get their allies, they get their in the parlance of the workplace bullying advocacy groups, they get their flying monkeys, and they've either tricked them to accept the DARVO response. But then what I've also seen, and in my former employment with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police up in Canada, where I've seen group DARVO, particularly as it relates to the issue. And I'm not sure if you've, I know in the US it might be a little bit different. Well, it's not different. I can say it's not different. But up in Canada, the RCMP is basically the national police force. So it's everything combined from the FBI, the DEA, the state police, the town police, municipal police, all in one in many organizations. So it's a massive organization. And there's been several major class action lawsuits that have been settled and won for sexual abuse, sexual harassment. And I've got a bit of a personal experience of that from my former career, where 4 female officers alleged sexual assault against one of the officers, another officer. We were all colleagues. We all kind of knew each other. And the outrage and the viciousness, the group outrage and group viciousness of his allies towards these 4 officers, I was privy to it, because they're expressing their opinion, and it's every horrible name you could think of in the book, and speculation on their motives and all these things. I mean, it was really, really vicious. And these were otherwise right-thinking, dedicated, committed police officers that are now engaging in group DARVO. And it's a phenomenon I'd love to explore more. It's like, how does that happen? What are your thoughts on that?
You're talking about something really important that we have not conducted research on, but I have observed it in the real world. And you're absolutely right. People get very caught up. It's this circling the wagon thing I've seen. That somebody gets accused who's in let's say, I mean, you see it in all sorts of workplace contexts. So where I've seen it is in academia. A professor gets accused of something, and his or her friends and colleagues just circle around that person in a protective way, and in the process start to attack whoever made the allegations. And often those allegations are actually true. Yeah. And later they may have to back down, because they're not the people that do that circling are not kind of normally bad people in that way.
Right.
They do get caught up. It's almost like a mass hysteria or something. They get really caught up in it. So now you're just inspiring me to suggest some new research to my colleagues, because I do think we need to figure out how that happens, and how people get so deluded, where they sometimes feel terrible afterwards that they were, and write apology letters to the true victim and say, I'm so sorry, because they cause harm when they do that.
Absolutely. I just was involved in a case just recently where this malevolent master manipulator had people circle around him. he was making the most egregious of counter allegations against his accuser, his victim. And one of them recently, well, not several of them broke free from him because they saw that it was almost like a cult-like loyalty that he was bringing around himself, and they got trapped in his lies. And so they've since broken free and now cooperating with us in our investigation to say, look, I bought into what he was saying. I truly believed that the victim was this horrible, despicable person engaged in the most egregious of behavior because of his lies and his manipulation. And so you're looking at research in terms of that group, I'd love to be a part of that with you, because just from an anecdotal experience perspective, I've seen it, I've observed it. The idea of this group DARVO. I want to bring it back, and I know that this is maybe not your area of expertise, but because this podcast is, related primarily to we have several branches in our firm. One of them, of course, being the church and faith-based. Dr. Randall Rouser is our director of that. And so Randall and I just completed a book called Disabuse, which is the name of our podcast. And the added complexity within church and faith-based organizations is this concept of spiritual abuse, like the spiritual coercive control. And I have seen it personally where a spiritual leader, a pastor in a church, has engaged in multiple infractions related to sexual misconduct. And the circle of the wagons in that particular area was even more, I think, insidious or diluted or distorted, whatever you want to call it, because he had such, for lack of a better word, such a spell over people that he had been having this spiritual authority over for many years. And so I wonder what you think about that. I mean, and by the way, I know that maybe this is not your area of expertise, but I can tell you bad behavior in the church is the same. It's no different than it is in the non-church world. So that's just for context there.
I mean, I think where my mind goes when you're describing this is another concept that I've been working on and proposed some time ago called institutional betrayal.
Right.
An institutional betrayal is when an institution harms people dependent upon it. And churches are institutions, and the more power somebody has within a church, the more potential they have to cause harm if they do things that have the weight of that institution behind them. And now you add the weight of maybe a deity, the weight of spiritual, the spiritual realm as a justification for their behavior. If what they're doing is actually wrong and harmful, then the potential for harm is all the greater. And I have talked to so many people who have been harmed in a faith-based context, and they describe just what you're talking about. And when they come to the point that they sort of start to actually realize what happened to them, because then that can take decades, they have to, among other things, forgive themselves eventually for being caught up in it, being vulnerable. But it's so understandable. And we know from research on institutional betrayal, it's highly associated with harm. And when DARVO occurs in these institutional contexts, it's just a kind of institutional betrayal. So, I think the more forms of power somebody or an organization has over a victim, the more potential harmful betrayal there can be. So I sort of want to just say it's extremely important we get this stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is education, some of the things you're doing and some of the things that we're doing as well, just to raise awareness of it. Coming from, I love the fact that you're coming from the place of academia, peer-reviewed research, those types of things. I'm not. I'm just coming from anecdotal. I've been dealing with people engaged in really egregious bad behavior for 40 years, and everything in between. And so it's interesting because I've seen it myself within the church faith-based organizations, both as a kid, as a nominal Catholic, and then later on in the evangelical world. And I don't go to church anymore myself personally, and part of it because this idea of sticking your head in the sand about potential abuse just absolutely goes against my own moral compass, and I cannot go along with it. And so, but we've seen and heard so many stories of sexual abuse in the churches, highly manipulative, coercive control from a bullying perspective in the churches. And there's, this whole idea of, with the hashtag Me Too movement, there's this idea of a hashtag Church Too movement, in that people are now starting to blow the whistle, expose. And I think social media has had an impact on that. So people are able to tell their story. And if that story is something that the public needs to know, oftentimes mainstream media pick it up, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm seeing this clash between what's historically been, quote, swept under the carpet, where some of the progressive churches and organizations we're working with that are taking this seriously, they've tasked us with investigating 20, 30, 40-year historical sexual abuse cases. And so that they can get to the truth, and they can make amends, and they can repair the harm that has happened. I mean, the obviously the abuse in the Catholic Church system has been, widely reported on, but this goes on in I think wherever people are people, and there's these power things going on, and so institutional betrayal. Interesting. One of the slides that I use on my course, and it's a little bit sensitive, is that one of the four women that I referred to earlier, many years later, died by suicide. And the evidence that she had given to her friends and her family was this sense that I belonged to this prestigious, internationally renowned police service. I reported a sexual assault. And the betrayal that I felt as a result of how the institution responded was a major factor in her deteriorating mental health. And it's a painful, painful story. And that's only one that I'm personally aware of because I know the people. And I know that you would see from your research that this is happening everywhere.
Spread. And what you're describing is one of the really tragic things we've looked at in research, and other people as well. Researchers have discovered that the odds of attempting suicide are measurably higher for people who've experienced institutional betrayal after, say, a sexual assault, compared to people who did not have that institutional betrayal but did have the sexual assault. So
Right.
it's like it's adding this level of harm. And one of the things that first inspired us to study institutional betrayal was in the US, it was coming to light how much sexual assault there was in the military. Now, about 15 years ago, it was making a lot of headlines. And victims would say, well, I joined the service to, help my country, but then I was sexually assaulted and that was terrible. But when I reported it and what happened afterwards was worse than the sexual assault. When somebody says something's worse than sexual assault, that, really stands out. And so to me, institutional betrayal is a life and death matter. I think one of the things that I am hopeful about is that institutions can change their ways here. And, ignorance has played such a role in all these things. I mean, if institutions can understand their power to harm or heal, and also understand which actions are harmful and which are healing, there's the potential to make a really better world.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of the things that I've said, like, because I interact a lot with organizations, and as we're doing both investigations, impartial investigations, but also education. How do you mitigate your risk? And I always say that I'm going to simplify it because I'm a simple guy and I like to simplify concepts. Organizations, institutions mitigate their risks of causing further harm by doing the right thing. And I think that we all intrinsically know what the right thing is. Get rid of all the noise, get rid of the influences, get rid of the power plays, get rid of the, I see organizations cover up for their rainmaker, their rock star, their person that's, bringing in, producing, and they turn a blind eye to all of these behaviors that are harmful. They're not doing the right thing. And so, simplifying it, just do the right thing based on the evidence we have, do the right thing. And again, the complexities of organizations and power structures and those types of things all come into play. I see a lot of, what I would call unwitting cover-up, where people are covering up unwittingly. So it's not a purposeful cover-up, but they're just unwitting in how that they're responding to it. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, this is so close to the core of betrayal trauma theory, which is about how people can remain unaware of the betrayals they've experienced or they've observed around them. And the core idea is that people's unawareness is serving a very critical function for them, which is letting them stay in relationships and situations that are meeting some of their needs. And if you can remain unaware of the betrayals, then you can stay in those situations. So if you're in a marriage where betrayal is going on, but you can kind of trick yourself into not seeing that betrayal, you can stay in the marriage. And if you see it, you might rock the boat such that you lose that marriage. And maybe that's just too scary or too unsafe for you. If if you're in a church that you really feel you need for your core identity and well-being, and you see that these bad things are going on, it's going to be hard to stay in that church without risking your position. If you bring the topic up or whatever, you may get punished and kicked out. So betrayal blindness is a way to just keep your position. And so people's unwitting cover up is often because they are engaging in betrayal blindness. It suits their own needs to not see it. And it's not like they make a conscious decision. Some do, but it doesn't require a conscious decision. It can all happen kind of outside of conscious awareness, that you just turn a blind eye because it helps you keep your spot in the system. And I think one of the things, we need to do is give people ways that they can safely see the truth without it being too scary. We don't have a lot of we just need a lot more gentle approaches to the aftermath of wrongdoing, more what I would call truth and reconciliation kind of approaches that give people some space. I mean, another thing we're talking about, responses to an accusation besides DARVO, the best response is an apology, because usually if somebody's accusing you of something, you actually did do it.
Yeah.
And sincere apologies can be so healing for everybody involved. But apologies are going to feel very unsafe if we have an extremely harsh system around people. So I think there's, a whole approach here to making it possible for people to raise difficult topics, to confess to their errors, that would allow us to heal in ways that we currently do not give people that space.
Right. I think one of the factors, I guess, I agree with you in terms of, ideal, but I think one of the factors that contributes to someone not willing to apologize or not willing to acknowledge their abuse is the potential consequence. Obviously, if it's sexual assault, there's going to be criminal charges. There's going to be, that type of thing where there is a significant consequence. But I think social media has a lot to do with it as well, in that if someone is terminated from the workplace for sexual abuse, or exposed as a church leader for sexual abuse, or their reputation and career is done. So the motivation is very, very high. And I always say this, and I'm not sure what your research has shown, but as an investigator, I always say that there's only two types of responses to an allegation of sexual abuse. One is consent, that there was a level of consent, that this was an ongoing consensual relationship with two adults or whatever it was. The other one is it didn't happen. And so it didn't happen. That's your DARVO. Then you get the DARVO response. The consent can also have DARVO as well, because someone could say, no, I didn't consent. right? And so I think that accountability, and I agree with you, is that if we could kind of, for lack of a better word, soften the consequence or soften the accountabilities, we may have more people, kind of come forward and say, look, I engaged in behavior that was absolutely harmful and hurtful, and I want to make it right. But I think this idea of once someone, and I've seen it, whether it be in on social media or other areas where someone's behavior has been highlighted, just a quick Google search, you're going to know someone was terminated for sexual assault or sexual abuse. That basically is a lifelong sentence online. And I think so. My point being is that the motives are very high to deny or at the very least allege consent.
Yeah, no, some people I should add try both defenses. It's quite interesting. They'll say it didn't happen, and if it did, it was,
That's right, exactly. Yeah,
so it's sort of amazing. Yeah, but it's interesting because I do know there's this feeling that if somebody has been accused of sexual misbehavior, it's going to ruin their reputation forever. And you're right, at some level, the internet's forever. But researchers who have tracked the outcome of such people find that actually they quickly rebound and regain their positions on average of power and status, whereas the people who've made the accusation often are the ones who are actually suffering the long-term career consequences. So I think there's sometimes too much claim that somebody who's been accused of sexual harassment is forever
right.
ever ruined. And that, I mean, look who just won the election in the United States, and think back to the various accusations. It doesn't necessarily derail a career when there are accusations.
Yeah, good point. As a Canadian, I won't even go there, but suffice to say, I'm
wise.
I'm keeping track of what's going on south of the border. This has been an amazing, enlightening conversation with you, Dr. Freyd. And I wonder if I can ask you maybe just to kind of wrap us up with some advice for people engaged in either the investigations or addressing issues of abuse in organizations in all its forms. What kind of advice would you give in terms of how to be more effective as an investigator or someone with the authority and power to do the right thing?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of that already. One of the things I would say is that education does make a difference. People can cause harm by being ignorant. So, for instance, not knowing what typical victim responses are like. I've seen so many times a victim being disbelieved by well-meaning people because that victim had been passive,
Right.
had failed to report things at the time.
Yeah.
And the research is clear. That's a normal response to victimization. Yeah. So people need to be educated about that so they don't make the wrong attribution. Yeah. And the other thing more specifically about DARVO is investigators can, first of all, they can engage in DARVO themselves if they're not careful. They can get caught. They can become part of that group DARVO.
Absolutely.
And then they can be manipulated by DARVO. And so being really attuned and well educated, and I've even heard investigators say that before they start the conversation with somebody who's been accused, they may make little notes to themselves about what to be paying attention to. That might be the start of a whole DARVO attack, so they catch it earlier before they get sucked into it. Yeah. So, those would be my main suggestions.
Well, and when you talk about awareness and education, I mean, we're very grateful at Veritas that we have the ability to have some impact in our training. We do train a lot of investigators right across Canada, and we're very grateful for you being with us here today, educating us from that level where. Doing a deep dive into some of your research, I think, is fascinating. It is enlightening, and so really appreciate all you've done in the study of this area to give us something in terms of a concept within an idea such as DARVO, an institutional betrayal, and frankly, it's universal, whether it be in churches, universities, workplaces, sport organizations, sport teams. It's universal. Where people are people, we're likely to see this. So I really appreciate you becoming a guest on our podcast here, and wish you all the best in the future research as well.